Section 0 of Germinal by Emile Zola, translation by Havelock Ellis. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Matt Berard. Section 0, Introduction by Havelock Ellis. Germinal was published in 1885, after occupying Zola during the previous year, in accordance with his usual custom, but to a greater extent than with any other of his books, except La Débâcle. He accumulated material beforehand. For 6 months he traveled about the coal mining district in northern France and Belgium, especially the Borinage around Mons, notebook in hand. He was inquisitive. Was that gentleman, Miner told Sherard, who visited the neighborhood at a later period and found that the miners in every village knew Germinal. That was a tribute of admiration the book deserved, but it was never one of Zola's most popular novels. It was neither amusing enough nor outrageous enough to attract the multitude. Yet Germinal occupies a place among Zola's works which is constantly becoming more assured, so that to some critics it even begins to seem the only book of his that in the end may survive. In his own time, as we know, the accredited critics of the day could find no condemnation severe enough for Zola. Brunetière attacked him perpetually with a fury that seemed inexhaustible. Scherer could not even bear to hear his name mentioned. Anatole France, though he lived to relent, thought it would have been better if he had never been born. Even at that time, however, there were critics who inclined to view Germinal more favorably. Thus, Faguet, who was the recognized academic critic of the end of the last century, while he held that posterity would be unable to understand how Zola could ever have been popular, yet recognized him as in Germinal the heroic representative of democracy, incomparable in his power of describing crowds, and he realized how marvelous is the conclusion of this book. Today, when critics view Zola in the main with indifference rather than with horror, although he still retains his popular favor, the distinction of Germinal is yet more clearly recognized. Sellier, while regarding the capitalistic conditions presented as now of an ancient and almost extinct type, yet sees Germinal standing out as the poem of social mysticism, while André Gide, a completely modern critic who has left a deep mark on the present generation, observes somewhere that it may nowadays cause surprise that he should refer with admiration to Germinal, but it is a masterly book that fills him with astonishment. He can hardly believe that it was written in French, and still less that it should have been written in any other language. It seems that it should have been created in some international tongue. The high place thus claimed for Germinal will hardly seem exaggerated. The book was produced when Zola had at length achieved the full mastery of his art, and before his hand had, as in his latest novels, begun to lose its firm grasp. The subject lent itself, moreover, to his special aptitude for presenting in vivid outline great human groups, and to his special sympathy with the collective emotions and social aspirations of such groups. We do not, as so often in Zola's work, become painfully conscious that he is seeking to reproduce aspects of life with which he is imperfectly acquainted, or fitting them into scientific formulas which he was imperfectly understood. He shows a masterly grip of each separate group, and each represents some essential element of the whole. They are harmoniously balanced, and their mutual action and reaction leads on, inevitably, to the splendid tragic dose, with yet its great promise for the future. I will not here discuss Zola's literary art. I have done so in my book of Affirmations. It is enough to say that, Though he was not a great master of style, Zola never again wrote so finely as here. A word may be added to explain how this translation fell to the lot of one whose work has been in other fields. In 1893, the late A. Teixeira de Matos was arranging for private issue a series of complete versions of some of Zola's chief novels and offered to assign Germinal to me. My time was taken up with preliminary, but as yet unfruitful preparation for what I regarded as my own special task in life, and I felt that I must not neglect the opportunity of spending my spare time in making a modest addition to my income. My wife readily fell into the project and agreed, on the understanding that we shared the proceeds, to act as my amanuensis. So, in the little Cornish village over the sea we then occupied, the evenings of the early months of 1894 were spent over Germinal, I translating aloud, and she with swift, efficient, untiring pen following, now and then bettering my English dialogue with her pungent wit. In this way I was able to gain a more minute insight into the details of Zola's work, and a more impressive vision of the massive structure he here raised than can easily be acquired by the mere reader. That joint task has remained an abidingly pleasant memory. It is, moreover, a satisfaction to me to know that I have been responsible, however inadequately, for the only complete English version of this wonderful book, a great fresco, as Zola himself called it, a great prose epic, as it has seemed to some, worthy to compare with the great verse epics of old. End of section 0. Section 1 of Germinal by Emile Zola. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Matt Roy. Part 1, Chapter 1. Over the open plain, beneath a starless sky as dark and thick as ink, a man walked alone along the highway from Marchiennes to Montsou, a straight paved road 10 kilometers in length, intersecting the beetroot fields. He could not even see the black soil before him, and only felt the immense flat horizon by the gusts of March wind, squalls as strong as on the sea, and frozen from sweeping leagues of marsh and naked earth. No tree could be seen against the sky, and the road unrolled as straight as a pier in the midst of the blinding spray of darkness. The man had set out from Marchiennes about 2 o'clock. He walked with long strides, shivering beneath his worn cotton jacket and corduroy breeches. A small parcel tied in a check handkerchief troubled him much, and he pressed it against his side, sometimes with one elbow, sometimes with the other, so that he could slip to the bottom of his pockets both the benumbed hands that bled beneath the lashes of the wind. A single idea occupied his head, the empty head of a workman without work and without lodging, the hope that the cold would be less keen after sunrise. For an hour he went on thus, when on the left, 2 kilometers from Montsou, he saw red flames, 3 fires burning in the open air and apparently suspended. At first he hesitated, half afraid. Then he could not resist the painful need to warm his hands for a moment. The steep road led downwards, and everything disappeared. The man saw on his right a paling, a wall of coarse planks shutting in a line of rails, while a grassy slope rose on the left, surmounted by confused gables, a vision of a village with low uniform roofs. He went on some 200 paces. Suddenly, at a bend in the road, the fires reappeared close to him, though he could not understand how they burnt so high in the dead sky, like smoky moons. But on the level soil another sight had struck him. It was a heavy mass, a low pile of buildings from which rose the silhouette of a factory chimney. Occasional gleams appeared from dirty windows. 5 or 6 melancholy lanterns were hung outside to frames of blackened wood, which vaguely outlined the profiles of gigantic stages; and from this fantastic apparition, drowned in night and smoke, a single voice arose, the thick, long breathing of a steam escapement that could not be seen. Then the man recognized the pit. His despair returned. What was the good? There would be no work. Instead of turning towards the buildings, he decided at last to ascend the pit bank, on which burnt in iron baskets the 3 coal fires which gave light and warmth for work. The labourers in the cutting must have been working late; they were still throwing out the useless rubbish. Now he heard the landers push the wagons on the stages. He could distinguish living shadows tipping over the trams or tubs near each fire. "Good day," he said, approaching one of the baskets. Turning his back to the fire, the carman stood upright. He was an old man, dressed in knitted violet wool, with a rabbit skin cap on his head; while his horse, a great yellow horse, waited with the immobility of stone while they emptied the 6 trains he drew. The workman employed at the tipping cradle, a red haired, lean fellow, did not hurry himself. He pressed on the lever with a sleepy hand. And above, the wind grew stronger, an icy north wind, and its great regular breaths passed by like the strokes of a scythe. "Good day," replied the old man. There was silence. The man, who felt that he was being looked at suspiciously, at once told his name. "I am called Étienne Lantier. I am an engine man. Any work here?" The flames lit him up. He might be about 21 years of age, a very dark, handsome man, who looked strong in spite of his thin limbs. The carman, thus reassured, shook his head. "Work for an engine man? No, no! There were 2 came yesterday. There's nothing." A gust cut short their speech. Then Étienne asked, pointing to the sombre pile of buildings at the foot of the platform: "A pit, isn't it?" The old man this time could not reply. He was strangled by a violent cough. At last he expectorated, and his expectoration left a black patch on the purple soil. "Yes, a pit. The Voreux. There, the settlement is quite near." In his turn, and with extended arm, he pointed out in the night the village of which the young man had vaguely seen the roofs. But the 6 trams were empty, and he followed them without cracking his whip, his legs stiffened by rheumatism, while the great yellow horse went on of itself, pulling heavily between the rails, beneath a new gust which bristled its coat. The Voreux was now emerging from the gloom. Étienne, who forgot himself before the stove, warming his poor bleeding hands, looked round and could see each part of the pit: the shed tarred with siftings, the pit frame, the vast chamber of the winding machine, the square turret of the exhaustion pump. This pit, piled up in the bottom of a hollow, with its squat brick buildings, raising its chimney like a threatening horn, seemed to him to have the evil air of a gluttonous beast crouching there to devour the earth. While examining it, he thought of himself, of his vagabond existence. These 8 days he had been seeking work. He saw himself again at his workshop at the railway, delivering a blow at his foreman, driven from Lille, driven from everywhere. On Saturday he had arrived at Marchiennes, where they said that work was to be had at the forges, and there was nothing, neither at the forges nor at Sonneville's. He had been obliged to pass the Sunday hidden beneath the wood of a cartwright's yard, from which the watchman had just turned him out at 2 o'clock in the morning. He had nothing, not a penny, not even a crust. What should he do, wandering along the roads without aim, not knowing where to shelter himself from the wind? Yes, it was certainly a pit. The occasional lanterns lighted up the square. A door, suddenly opened, had enabled him to catch sight of the furnaces in a clear light. He could explain even the escapement of the pump, that thick, long breathing that went on without ceasing, and which seemed to be the monster's congested respiration. The workman, expanding his back at the tipping cradle, had not even lifted his eyes on Étienne, and the latter was about to pick up his little bundle which had fallen to the earth, when a spasm of coughing announced the carman's return. Slowly he emerged from the darkness, followed by the yellow horse drawing 6 more laden trams. "Are there factories at Montsou?" asked the young man. The old man expectorated, then replied in the wind: "Oh, it isn't factories that are lacking. Should have seen it 3 or 4 years ago. Everything was roaring then. There were not men enough. There never were such wages. And now they are tightening their bellies again. Nothing but misery in the country. Every one is being sent away, workshops closing one after the other. It is not the Emperor's fault, perhaps, but why should he go and fight in America, without counting that the beasts are dying from cholera like the people?" Then, in short sentences and with broken breath, the two continued to complain. Étienne narrated his vain wanderings of the past week. Must one then die of hunger? Soon the roads would be full of beggars. "Yes," said the old man, "this will turn out badly, for God does not allow so many Christians to be thrown on the street." "We don't have meat every day." "But if one had bread." "True, if one only had bread." Their voices were lost, gusts of wind carrying away the words in a melancholy howl. "Here," began the carman again, very loudly, turning towards the south. "Montsou is over there." And stretching out his hand again, he pointed out invisible spots in the darkness as he named them. Below, at Montsou, the Fauvelle sugar works were still going, but the Hoton sugar works had just been dismissing hands. There were only the Dutilleul flour mill and the Bleu rope walk for mine cables which kept up. Then, with a large gesture, he indicated the north half of the horizon. The Sonneville workshops had not received 2/3 of their usual orders. Only 2 of the 3 blast furnaces of the Marchiennes forges were alight. Finally, at the Guéjois glassworks, a strike was threatening, for there was talk of a reduction of wages. I know," replied the young man at each indication. "I have been there." "With us here things are going on at present," added the carman, "but the pits have lowered their output. And see, opposite, at the Victoire, there are also only 2 batteries of coke furnaces alight." He expectorated and set out behind his sleepy horse, after harnessing it to the empty trams. Now Étienne could oversee the entire country. The darkness remained profound, but the old man's hand had, as it were, filled it with great miseries, which the young man unconsciously felt at this moment around him everywhere in the limitless tract. Was it not a cry of famine that the March wind rolled up across this naked plain? The squalls were furious, they seemed to bring the death of labour, of famine which would kill many men. And with wandering eyes he tried to pierce shades, tormented at once by the desire and by the fear of seeing. Everything was hidden in the unknown depths of the gloomy night. He only perceived, very far off, the blast furnaces and the coke ovens. The latter, with their hundreds of chimneys planted obliquely, made lines of red flame, while the 2 towers, more to the left, burnt blue against the blank sky, like giant torches. It resembled a melancholy conflagration. No other stars rose on the threatening horizon except these nocturnal fires in a land of coal and iron. "You belong to Belgium, perhaps?" began again the carman, who had returned behind Étienne. This time he only brought 3 trams. Those at least could be tipped over. An accident which had happened to the cage, a broken screw nut, would stop work for a good quarter of an hour. At the bottom of the pit bank there was silence. The landers no longer shook the stages with a prolonged vibration. One only heard from the pit the distant sound of a hammer tapping on an iron plate. "No, I come from the south," replied the young man. The workman, after having emptied the trams, had seated himself on the earth, glad of the accident. maintaining his savage silence. He had simply lifted his large, dim eyes to the carman, as if annoyed by so many words. The latter, indeed, did not usually talk at such length. The unknown man's face must have pleased him that he should have been taken by one of these itchings for confidence which sometimes make old people talk aloud, even when alone. "I belong to Montsou," he said. "I am called Bonnemort." "Is it a nickname?" asked Étienne, astonished. The old man made a grimace of satisfaction, and pointed to the Voreux. "Yes, yes, they have pulled me 3 times out of that, torn to pieces, once with all my hair scorched, once with my gizzard full of earth, and another time with my belly swollen with water, like a frog. And then, when they saw that nothing would kill me, they called me Bonnemort, for a joke." His cheerfulness increased, like the creaking of an ill greased pulley, and ended by degenerating into a terrible spasm of coughing. The fire basket now clearly lit up his large head, with its scanty white hair and flat, livid face, spotted with bluish patches. He was short, with an enormous neck, projecting calves and heels, and long arms, with massive hands falling to his knees. For the rest, like his horse, which stood immovable, without suffering from the wind, he seemed to be made of stone. He had no appearance of feeling either the cold or the gusts that whistled at his ears. When he coughed, his throat was torn by a deep rasping. He spat at the foot of the basket, and the earth was blackened. Étienne looked at him and at the ground which he had thus stained. "Have you been working long at the mine?" Bonnemort flung open both arms. "Long? I should think so. I was not 8 when I went down into the Voreux, and I am now 58. Reckon that up. I have been everything down there. At first trammer, then putter, when I had the strength to wheel, then pikeman for 18 years. Then because of my cursed legs they put me into the earth cutting, to bank up and patch, until they had to bring me up because the doctor said I should stay there for good. Then, after 5 years of that, they made me carman. Eh? That's fine. 50 years at the mine, 45 down below." While he was speaking, fragments of burning coal, which now and then fell from the basket, lit up his pale face with their red reflection. "They tell me to rest," he went on, "but I'm not going to. I'm not such a fool. I can get on for 2 years longer, to my 60th, so as to get the pension of 180 francs. If I wished them good evening today, they would give me 150 at once. They are cunning, the beggars. Besides, I am sound, except my legs. You see, it's the water which has got under my skin through being always wet in the cuttings. There are days when I can't move a paw without screaming." A spasm of coughing interrupted him again. "And that makes you cough so?" said Étienne. But he vigorously shook his head. Then, when he could speak: "No, no! I caught cold a month ago. I never used to cough. Now I can't get rid of it, and the queer thing is that I spit, that I spit." The rasping was again heard in his throat, followed by the black expectoration. "Is it blood?" asked Étienne, at last venturing to question him. Bonnemort slowly wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "It's coal. I've got enough in my carcass to warm me till I die. And it's 5 years since I put a foot down below. I stored it up, it seems, without knowing it. It keeps you alive." There was silence. The distant hammers struck regular blows in the pit, and the wind passed by with its moan, like a cry of hunger and weariness coming out of the depths of the night. Before the flames, which grew low, the old man went on in lower tones, chewing over again his old recollections. Ah, certainly, it was not yesterday that he and his began hammering at the seam. The family had worked for the Montsou mining company since it started, and that was long ago, 106 years already. His grandfather, Guillaume Maheu, an urchin of 15 then, had found the rich coal at Réquillart, the company's first pit, an old abandoned pit to day, down below near the Fauvelle sugar works. All the country knew it, and as a proof, the discovered scene was called the Guillaume, after his grandfather. He had not known him, a big fellow it was said, very strong, who died of old age at 60. Then his father, Nicolas Maheu, called Le Rouge, when hardly 40 years of age, had died in the pit, which was being excavated at that time. A landslip, a complete slide, and the rock drank his blood and swallowed his bones. Two of his uncles and his three brothers, later on, also left their skins there. He, Vincent Maheu, who had come out almost whole, except that his legs were rather shaky, was looked upon as a knowing fellow. But what could one do? One must work. One worked here from father to son, as one would work at anything else. His son, Toussaint Maheu, was being worked to death there now, and his grandsons, and all his people, who lived opposite in the settlement. 106 years of mining, the youngsters after the old ones, for the same master, eh? There were many bourgeois that could not give their history so well. Anyhow, when one has got enough to eat, murmured Étienne again. That is what I say. As long as one has bread to eat, one can live. Bonnemort was silent, and his eyes turned towards the settlement, where lights were appearing one by one. 4 o'clock struck in the Montsou tower, and the cold became keener. And is your company rich? Asked Étienne. The old man shrugged his shoulders, and then let them fall as if overwhelmed beneath an avalanche of gold. Ah, yes! Not perhaps so rich as its neighbour, the Anzin Company, but millions and millions all the same. They can't count it. 19 pits, 13 at work, the Voreux, the Victoire, Crécourt, Mirou, Saint Thomas, Madeleine, Fautré Canin, and still more. And 6 for pumping or ventilation, like Réquillart. 10,000 workers, concessions reaching over 67 communes, an output of 5,000 tons a day, a railway joining all the pits, and workshops, and factories. Ah, yes! There's money there. The rolling of trams on the stages made the big yellow horse prick his ears. The cage was evidently repaired below, and the landers had got to work again. While he was harnessing his beast to redescend, the carman added gently, addressing himself to the horse: "Won't do to chatter, lazy good for nothing. If Monsieur Hennebeau knew how you waste your time!" Étienne looked thoughtfully into the night. He asked: "Then Monsieur Hennebeau owns the mine?" "No," explained the old man. "Monsieur Hennebeau is only the general manager. He is paid just the same as us." With a gesture the young man pointed into the darkness. "Who does it all belong to then?" But Bonnemort was for a moment so suffocated by a new and violent spasm that he could not get his breath. Then, when he had expectorated and wiped the black froth from his lips, he replied in the rising wind: "Eh? All that belong to? Nobody knows. To people." And with his hand he pointed in the darkness to a vague spot, an unknown and remote place, inhabited by those people for whom the Maheus had been hammering at the seam for more than a century. His voice assumed a tone of religious awe. It was as if he were speaking of an inaccessible tabernacle containing a sated and crouching God to whom they had given all their flesh, and whom they had never seen. "At all events, if one can get enough bread to eat," repeated Étienne, for the third time, without any apparent transition. "Indeed, yes, if we could always get bread, it would be too good." The horse had started. The carman, in his turn, disappeared, with the trailing step of an invalid. Near the tipping cradle the workman had not stirred, gathered up in a ball, burying his chin between his knees, with his great dim eyes fixed on emptiness. When he had picked up his bundle, Étienne still remained at the same spot. He felt the gusts freezing his back, while his chest was burning before the large fire. Perhaps, all the same, it would be as well to inquire at the pit. The old man might not know. Then he resigned himself. He would accept any work. Where should he go, and what was to become of him in this country famished for lack of work? Must he leave his carcass behind a wall, like a strayed dog? But one doubt troubled him, a fear of the Voreux in the middle of this flat plain, drowned in so thick a night. At every gust the wind seemed to rise as if it blew from an ever broadening horizon. No dawn whitened the dead sky; the blast furnaces alone flamed, and the coke ovens, making the darkness redder without illuminating the unknown. And the Voreux, at the bottom of its hole, with its posture as of an evil beast, continued to crunch, breathing with a heavier and slower respiration, troubled by its painful digestion of human flesh. End of section 1. Section 2 of Germinal by Émile Zola, translated by Havelock Ellis. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Matt Perard. Part 1. Chapter 2. In the middle of the fields of wheat and beetroot, the Deux Cent Quarante settlement slept beneath the black night. One could vaguely distinguish 4 immense blocks of small houses, back to back, barracks or hospital blocks, geometric and parallel, separated by 3 large avenues which were divided into gardens of equal size. And over the desert plain one heard only the moan of squalls through the broken trellises of the enclosures. In the Maheus' house, number 16 in the second block, nothing was stirring. The single room that occupied the first floor was drowned in a thick darkness which seemed to overwhelm with its weight the sleep of the beings whom one felt to be there in a mass, with open mouths, overcome by weariness. In spite of the keen cold outside, there was a living heat in the heavy air, that hot stuffiness of even the best kept bedrooms, the smell of human cattle. 4 o'clock had struck from the clock in the room on the ground floor, but nothing yet stirred. One heard the piping of slender respirations, accompanied by 2 series of sonorous snores. And suddenly Catherine got up. In her weariness she had, as usual, counted the 4 strokes through the floor without the strength to arouse herself completely. Then, throwing her legs from under the bedclothes, she felt about, at last struck a match and lighted the candle. But she remained seated, her head so heavy that it fell back between her shoulders, seeking to return to the bolster. Now the candle lighted up the room, a square room with 2 windows, and filled with 3 beds. There could be seen a cupboard, a table, and 2 old walnut chairs, whose smoky tone made hard dark patches against the walls, which were painted a light yellow. And nothing else, only clothes hung to nails, a jug placed on the floor, and a red pan which served as a basin. In the bed on the left, Zacharie, the eldest, a youth of 21, was asleep with his brother Jeanlin, who had completed his 11th year. In the right-hand bed 2 urchins, Lénore and Henri. The first 6 years old, the second 4, slept in each other's arms, while Catherine shared the 3rd bed with her sister, Alzire, so small for her 9 years that Catherine would not have felt her near her if it were not for the little invalid's humpback, which pressed into her side. The glass door was open. One could perceive this lobby of a landing, a sort of recess in which the father and the mother occupied a 4th bed, against which they had been obliged to install the cradle of the latest comer, Estelle, aged scarcely 3 months. However, Catherine made a desperate effort. She stretched herself, she fidgeted her 2 hands in the red hair which covered her forehead and neck. Slender for her 15 years, all that showed of her limbs outside the narrow sheath of her chemise were her bluish feet, as it were tattooed with coal, and her slight arms, the milky whiteness of which contrasted with the sallow tint of her face, already spoilt by constant washing with black soap. A final yawn opened her rather large mouth with splendid teeth against the chlorotic pallor of her gums. while her grey eyes were crying in her fight with sleep, with a look of painful distress and weariness which seemed to spread over the whole of her naked body. But a growl came from the landing, and Maheu's thick voice stammered: "Devil take it! It's time. Is it you lighting up, Catherine?" "Yes, father. It has just struck downstairs." "Quick then, lazy! If you had danced less on Sunday you would have woke up earlier. A fine lazy life!" And he went on grumbling, but sleep returned to him also. His reproaches became confused, and were extinguished in fresh snoring. The young girl in her chemise, with her naked feet on the floor, moved about in the room. As she passed by the bed of Henri and Lénore, she replaced the coverlet which had slipped down. They did not wake, lost in the strong sleep of childhood. Alzire, with open eyes, had turned to take the warm place of her big sister without speaking. "I say now, Zacharie, and you, Jeanlin, I say now!" repeated Catherine, standing before her two brothers, who were still wallowing with their noses in the bolster. She had to seize the elder by the shoulder and shake him. Then, while he was muttering abuse, it came into her head to uncover them by snatching away the sheet. That seemed funny to her, and she began to laugh when she saw the two boys struggling with naked legs. "Stupid! Leave me alone!" growled Zacharie in ill temper, sitting up. "I don't like tricks. Good Lord! Say it's time to get up!" He was lean and ill made, with a long face and a chin which showed signs of a sprouting beard, yellow hair, and the anaemic pallor which belonged to his whole family. His shirt had rolled up to his belly, and he lowered it, not from modesty, but because he was not warm. "It has struck downstairs," repeated Catherine. "Come! Up! Father's angry." Jeanlin, who had rolled himself up, closed his eyes, saying: "Go and hang yourself. I'm going to sleep." She laughed again, the laugh of a good natured girl. He was so small, his limbs so thin, with enormous joints, enlarged by scrofula, that she took him up in her arms. But he kicked about, his apish face, pale and wrinkled, with its green eyes and great ears, grew pale with the rage of weakness. He said nothing, he bit her right breast. "Beastly fellow!" she murmured, keeping back a cry and putting him on the floor. Alzire was silent, with the sheet tucked under her chin. But she had not gone to sleep again. With her intelligent invalid's eyes, she followed her sister and her two brothers, who were now dressing. Another quarrel broke out around the pan. The boys hustled the young girl because she was so long washing herself. Shirts flew about, and, while still half asleep, they eased themselves without shame, with the tranquil satisfaction of a litter of puppies that have grown up together. Catherine was ready first. She put on her miner's breeches, then her canvas jacket, and fastened the blue cap on her knotted hair. In these clean Monday clothes she had the appearance of a little man. Nothing remained to indicate her sex, except the slight roll of her hips. "When the old man comes back," said Zacharie mischievously, "he'll like to find the bed unmade. You know I shall tell him it's you." The old man was the grandfather, Bonnemort, who, as he worked during the night, slept by day, so that the bed was never cold. There was always someone snoring there. Without replying, Catherine set herself to arrange the bedclothes and tuck them in. But during the last moments sounds had been heard behind the wall in the next house. These brick buildings, economically put up by the Company, were so thin that the least breath could be heard through them. The inmates lived there, elbow to elbow, from one end to the other, and no fact of family life remained hidden, even from the youngsters. A heavy step had tramped up the staircase, then there was a kind of soft fall, followed by a sigh of satisfaction. "Good!" said Catherine. "Levaque has gone down, and here is Bouteloup come to join the Levaque woman." Jeanlin grinned. Even Alzire's eyes shone. Every morning they made fun of the household of three next door, a pipeman who lodged a worker in the cutting, an arrangement which gave the woman two men, one by night, the other by day. "Philoméne is coughing," began Catherine again, after listening. She was speaking of the eldest Levaque, a big girl of 19. and the mistress of Zacharie, by whom she had already had two children. Her chest was so delicate that she was only a sifter at the pit, never having been able to work below. "Pooh, Philoméne," replied Zacharie, "she cares a lot. She's asleep. It's hoggish to sleep till 6." He was putting on his breeches when an idea occurred to him, and he opened the window. Outside in the darkness the settlement was awaking. Lights were dawning one by one between the laths of the shutters. And there was another dispute. He leant out to watch if he could not see. Coming out of Pierron's opposite, the captain of the Voreux, who was accused of sleeping with the Pierron woman, while his sister called to him that since the day before the husband had taken day duty at the pit eye, and that certainly Dansaert could not have slept there that night. While the air entered in icy whiffs, both of them, becoming angry, maintained the truth of their own information, until cries and tears broke out. It was Estelle, in her cradle, vexed by the cold. Maheude woke up suddenly. What had he got in his bones then? Here he was going to sleep again like a good for nothing. And he swore so vigorously that the children became still. Zacharie and Jeanlin finished washing with slow weariness. Alzire, with her large open eyes, continually stared. The two youngsters, Lénore and Henri, in each other's arms, had not stirred, breathing in the same quiet way in spite of the noise. "Catherine, give me the candle," called out Maheude. She finished buttoning her jacket, and carried the candle into the closet, leaving her brothers to look for their clothes by what light came through the door. Her father jumped out of bed. She did not stop, but went downstairs in her coarse woollen stockings, feeling her way, and lighted another candle in the parlour to prepare the coffee. All the sabots of the family were beneath the sideboard. "Will you be still, vermin?" began Maheu, again exasperated by Estelle's cries, which still went on. He was short, like old Bonnemort, and resembled him, with his strong head, his flat, livid face, beneath yellow hair cut very short. The child screamed more than ever, frightened by those great knotted arms which were held above her. "Leave her alone, you know that she won't be still," said his wife, stretching herself in the middle of the bed. She also had just awakened, and was complaining how disgusting it was never to be able to finish the night. Could they not go away quietly? Buried in the clothes, she only showed her long face with the large features of a heavy beauty, already disfigured at 39 by her life of wretchedness and the 7 children she had borne. With her eyes on the ceiling, she spoke slowly, while her man dressed himself. They both ceased to hear the little one, who was strangling herself with screaming. "Eh? You know I haven't a penny, and this is only Monday. Still 6 days before the fortnight's out. This can't go on. You, all of you, only bring in 9 francs. How do you expect me to go on? We are 10 in the house." "Oh, 9 francs!" exclaimed Maheu. "I and Zacharie 3, that makes 6. Catherine and the father 2, that makes 4. 4 and 6, 10. And Jeanlin 1, that makes 11." "Yes, 11, but there are Sundays and the off days. Never more than 9, you know." He did not reply, being occupied in looking on the ground for his leather belt. Then he said, on getting up: "Mustn't complain. I am sound all the same. There's more than one at 42 who are put to the patching." "Maybe, old man, but that does not give us bread. Where am I to get it from, eh? Have you got nothing?" "I've got 2 coppers." "Keep them for a half pint. Good Lord! Where am I to get it from? 6 days! It will never end. We owe 60 francs to Maigrat, who turned me out of doors day before yesterday. That won't prevent me from going to see him again. But if he goes on refusing!" And Maheude continued in her melancholy voice, without moving her head, only closing her eyes now and then beneath the dim light of the candle. She said the cupboard was empty, the little ones asking for bread and butter, even the coffee was done, and the water caused colic, and the long days passed in deceiving hunger with boiled cabbage leaves. Little by little she had been obliged to raise her voice, for Estelle's screams drowned her words. These cries became unbearable. Maheu seemed all at once to hear them, and, in a fury, snatched the little one up from the cradle and threw it on the mother's bed, stammering with rage: "Here, take her! I'll do for her! Damn the child! It wants for nothing! It sucks, and it complains louder than all the rest!" Estelle began, in fact, to suck. Hidden beneath the clothes and soothed by the warmth of the bed, her cries subsided into the greedy little sound of her lips. "Haven't the Piolaine people told you to go and see them?" asked the father, after a period of silence. The mother bit her lip with an air of discouraged doubt. "Yes, they met me. They were carrying clothes for poor children. Yes, I'll take Lénore and Henri to them this morning, if they only give me a few pence." There was silence again. Maheu was ready. He remained a moment motionless, then added, in his hollow voice: "What is it that you want? Let things be, and see about the soup. It's no good talking. Better be at work down below." "True enough," replied Maheu. "Blow out the candle. I don't need to see the colour of my thoughts." He blew out the candle. Zacharie and Jeanlin were already going down. He followed them, and the wooden staircase creaked beneath their heavy feet, clad in wool. Behind them the closet and the room were again dark. The children slept. Even Alzire's eyelids were closed, but the mother now remained with her eyes open in the darkness, while, pulling at her breast, the pendant breast of an exhausted woman, Estelle was purring like a kitten. Down below, Catherine had at first occupied herself with the fire, which was burning in the iron grate, flanked by two ovens. The Company distributed every month to each family 8 hectolitres of a hard slaty coal, gathered in the passages. It burnt slowly, and the young girl who piled up the fire every night only had to stir it in the morning, adding a few fragments of soft coal, carefully picked out. Then, after having placed the kettle on the grate, she sat down before the sideboard. It was a fairly large room, occupying all the ground floor, painted in apple green, and of Flemish cleanliness, with its flags well washed and covered with white sand. Besides the sideboard of varnished deal, the furniture consisted of a table and chairs of the same wood. Stuck on to the walls were some violently coloured prints, portraits of the Emperor and the Empress, given by the Company, of soldiers and of saints, speckled with gold, contrasting crudely with the simple nudity of the room. And there was no other ornament except a box of rose coloured pasteboard on the sideboard, and the clock with its daubed face and loud tick tack, which seemed to fill the emptiness of the place. Near the staircase door another door led to the cellar. In spite of the cleanliness, an odour of cooked onion, shut up since the night before, poisoned the hot heavy air, always laden with an acrid flavour of coal. Catherine, in front of the sideboard, was reflecting. There only remained the end of a loaf, cheese in fair abundance, but hardly a morsel of butter, and she had to provide bread and butter for 4. At last she decided, cut the slices, took one and covered it with cheese, spread another with butter, and stuck them together. That was the brick, the bread and butter sandwich taken to the pit every morning. The 4 bricks were soon on the table, in a row, cut with severe justice, from the big one for the father down to the little one for Jeanlin. Catherine, who appeared absorbed in her household duties, must, however, have been thinking of the stories told by Zacharie about the head captain and the Pierron woman, for she half opened the front door and glanced outside. The wind was still whistling. There were numerous spots of light on the low fronts of the settlement, from which arose a vague tremor of awakening. Already doors were being closed, and black files of workers passed into the night. It was stupid of her to get cold, since the porter at the pit eye was certainly asleep, waiting to take his duties at 6. Yet she remained and looked at the house on the other side of the gardens. The door opened, and her curiosity was aroused. But it could only be one of the little Pierrons, Lydie, setting out for the pit. The hissing sound of steam made her turn. She shut the door, and hastened back. The water was boiling over, and putting out the fire. There was no more coffee. She had to be content to add the water to last night's dregs. Then she sugared the coffee pot with brown sugar. At that moment her father and two brothers came downstairs. "Faith!" exclaimed Zacharie, when he had put his nose into his bowl, "here's something that won't get into our heads." Maheu shrugged his shoulders with an air of resignation. "Bah! it's hot, it's good all the same." Jeanlin had gathered up the fragments of bread and made a sop of them. After having drunk, Catherine finished by emptying the coffee pot into the tin jacks. All four, standing up in the smoky light of the candle, swallowed their meals hastily. "Are we at the end?" said the father. "One would say we were people of property." But a voice came from the staircase, of which they had left the door open. It was Maheude who was calling out: "Take all the bread. I have some vermicelli for the children." "Yes, yes," replied Catherine. She had piled up the fire, wedging the pot that held the remains of the soup into a corner of the grate, so that the grandfather might find it warm when he came in at 6. Each took his sabots from under the sideboard, passed the strings of his tin over his shoulder, and placed his brick at his back, between shirt and jacket. And they went out, the men first, the girl, who came last, blowing out the candle and turning the key. The house became dark again. "Ah, we're off together," said a man who was closing the door of the next house. It was Levaque, with his son Bébert, an urchin of 12, a great friend of Jeanlin's. Catherine, in surprise, stifled a laugh in Zacharie's ear. "Why, Bouteloup didn't even wait until the husband had gone." Now the lights in the settlement were extinguished, and the last door banged. All again fell asleep, the women and the little ones resuming their slumber in the midst of wider beds. And from the extinguished village to the roaring Voreux a slow filing of shadows took place beneath the squalls, the departure of the colliers to their work, bending their shoulders and, incommoded by their arms, crossed on their breasts, while the brick behind formed a hump on each back. Clothed in their thin jackets, they shivered with cold, but without hastening, straggling along the road with the tramp of a flock. End of Section 2. Section 3 of Germinal by Émile Zola, translated by Havelock Ellis. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Matt Perard. Part 1, Chapter 3. Étienne had at last descended from the platform and entered the Voreux. He spoke to men whom he met, asking if there was work to be had, but all shook their heads, telling him to wait for the captain. They left him free to roam through the ill-lighted buildings, full of black holes, confusing with their complicated stories and rooms. After having mounted a dark and half-destroyed staircase, he found himself on a shaky foot‐bridge. Then he crossed the screening shed, which was plunged in such profound darkness that he walked with his hands before him for protection. Suddenly two enormous yellow eyes pierced the darkness in front of him. He was beneath the pit frame in the receiving room, at the very mouth of the shaft. A captain, Father Richomme, a big man with the face of a good‐natured gendarme, and with a straight grey moustache, was at that moment going towards the receiver's office. "Do they want a hand here for any kind of work?" asked Étienne again. Richomme was about to say no, but he changed his mind and replied like the others, as he went away: "Wait for Monsieur Dansaert, the head captain." 4 lanterns were placed there, and the reflectors which threw all the light on to the shaft vividly illuminated the iron rail, the levers of the signals and bars, the joists of the guides along which slid the 2 cages. The rest of the vast room, like the nave of a church, was obscure and peopled by great floating shadows. Only the lamp cabin shone at the far end, while in the receiver's office a small lamp looked like a fading star. Work was about to be resumed, and on the iron pavement there was a continual thunder, trams of coal being wheeled without ceasing, while the landers, with their long, bent backs, could be distinguished amid the movement of all these black and noisy things in perpetual agitation. For a moment Étienne stood motionless, deafened and blinded. He felt frozen by the currents of air which entered from every side. Then he moved on a few paces, attracted by the winding engine, of which he could now see the glistening steel and copper. It was 25 metres beyond the shaft, in a loftier chamber, and placed so solidly on its brick foundation that though it worked at full speed, with all its 400 horse power, the movement of its enormous crank, emerging and plunging with oily softness, imparted no quiver to the walls. The engine man, standing at his post, listened to the ringing of the signals, and his eye never moved from the indicator where the shaft was figured, with its different levels, by a vertical groove traversed by shot hanging to strings, which represented the cages, and at each departure, when the machine was put in motion, the drums, two immense wheels, 5 metres in radius, by means of which the two steel cables were rolled and unrolled, turned with such rapidity that they became like grey powder. "Look out there!" cried three landers, who were dragging an immense ladder. Étienne just escaped being crushed. His eyes were soon more at home, and he watched the cables moving in the air, more than 30 metres of steel ribbon, which flew up into the pit frame where they passed over pulleys to descend perpendicularly into the shaft where they were attached to the cages. An iron frame, like the high scaffolding of a belfry, supported the pulleys. It was like the gliding of a bird, noiseless, without a jar, this rapid flight, the continual come and go of a thread of enormous weight, capable of lifting 12,000 kilograms at the rate of 10 metres a second. "Attention there, for God's sake!" cried one of the landers, pushing the ladder to the other side in order to climb to the left-hand rowel. Slowly Étienne returned to the receiving room. This giant flight over his head took away his breath. Shivering in the currents of air, he watched the movement of the cages, his ears deafened by the rumblings of the trams. Near the shaft the signal was working, a heavy levered hammer drawn by a cord from below and allowed to strike against a block. One blow to stop, two to go down, three to go up. It was unceasing, like blows of a club dominating the tumult, accompanied by the clear sound of the bell, while the lander, directing the work, increased the noise still more by shouting orders to the engine man through a trumpet. The cages in the middle of the clear space appeared and disappeared, were filled and emptied, without Étienne being at all able to understand the complicated proceeding. He only understood one thing well. The shaft swallowed men by mouthfuls of 20 or 30, and with so easy a gulp that it seemed to feel nothing go down. Since 4 o'clock the descent of the workmen had been going on. They came to the shed with naked feet and their lamps in their hands, waiting in little groups until a sufficient number had arrived. Without a sound, with the soft bound of a nocturnal beast, the iron cage arose from the night, wedged itself on the bolts with its 4 decks, each containing 2 trams full of coal. Landers on different platforms took out the trams and replaced them by others, either empty or already laden with trimmed wooden props, and it was into the empty trams that the workmen crowded, 5 at a time, up to 40. When they filled all the compartments, an order came from the trumpet, a hollow, indistinct roar, while the signal cord was pulled 4 times from below, ringing meat, to give warning of this burden of human flesh. Then, after a slight leap, the cage plunged silently, falling like a stone, only leaving behind it the vibrating flight of a cable. "Is it deep?" asked Étienne of a miner, who waited near him with a sleepy air. 554 metres, replied the man, but there are 4 levels, the first at 320. Both were silent, with their eyes on the returning cable. Étienne said again: "And if it breaks?" "Ah, if it breaks!" The miner ended with a gesture. His turn had arrived. The cage had reappeared with its easy, unfatigued movement. He squatted in it with some comrades. It plunged down, then flew up again in less than 4 minutes to swallow down another load of men. For half an hour the shaft went on devouring in this fashion, with more or less greedy gulps, according to the depth of the level to which the men went down, but without stopping, always hungry, with its giant intestines capable of digesting a nation. It went on filling and still filling, and the darkness remained dead. The cage mounted from the void with the same voracious silence. Étienne was at last seized again by the same depression which he had experienced on the pit bank. What was the good of persisting? This head captain would send him off like the others. A vague fear suddenly decided him. He went away, only stopping before the building of the engine room. The wide open door showed 7 boilers with 2 furnaces. In the midst of the white steam and the whistling of the escapes, a stoker was occupied in piling up one of the furnaces, the heat of which could be felt as far as the threshold, and the young man was approaching, glad of the warmth, when he met a new band of colliers who had just arrived at the pit. It was the Maheu and Levaque set. When he saw Catherine at the head, with her gentle, boyish air, a superstitious idea caused him to risk another question. "I say there, mate, do you want a hand here for any kind of work?" She looked at him, surprised, rather frightened at this sudden voice coming out of the shadow. But Maheu, behind her, had heard and replied, talking with Étienne for a moment. No, no one was wanted. This poor devil of a man who had lost his way here interested him. When he left him, he said to the others: "Eh! one might easily be like that. Mustn't complain. Every one hasn't the chance to work himself to death." The band entered and went straight to the shed, a vast hall roughly boarded and surrounded by cupboards shut by padlocks. In the centre an iron fireplace, a sort of closed stove without a door, glowed red and was so stuffed with burning coal that fragments flew out and rolled on to the trodden soil. The hall was only lighted by this stove, from which sanguine reflections danced along the greasy woodwork up to the ceiling, stained with black dust. As the Maheus went into the heat, there was a sound of laughter. Some 30 workmen were standing upright with their backs to the fire, roasting themselves with an air of enjoyment. Before going down, they all came here to get a little warmth in their skins, so that they could face the dampness of the pit. But this morning there was much amusement. They were joking. Mouquette, a putter girl of 18, whose enormous breasts and flanks were bursting through her old jacket and breeches. She lived at Réquillart with her father, old Mouque, a groom, and Mouquette, her brother, a lander. But their hours of work were not the same. She went to the pit by herself, and in the middle of the wheatfields in summer, or against a wall in winter, she took her pleasure with her lover of the week. All in the mine had their turn. It was a perpetual round of comrades, without further consequences. One day, when reproached about a Marchiennes nail maker, she was furiously angry, exclaiming that she respected herself far too much, that she would cut her arm off if any one could boast that he had seen her with any one but a collier. "It isn't that big Chaval now," said a miner, grinning. "Did that little fellow have you? He must have needed a ladder. I saw you behind Réquillart, a token that he got up on a milestone." "Well," replied Mouquet, in a good humour, "what's that to do with you? You were not asked to push." And this gross, good natured joke increased the laughter of the men, who expanded their shoulders, half cooked by the stove, while she herself, shaken with laughter, was displaying in the midst of them the indecency of her costume, embarrassingly comical, with her masses of flesh exaggerated almost to disease. But the gaiety ceased. Mouquet told Maheu that Florence, big Florence, would never come again. She had been found the night before stiff in her bed. Some said it was her heart, others that it was a pint of gin she had drunk too quickly. And Maheu was in despair. Another piece of ill luck. One of the best of his putters gone without any chance of replacing her at once. He was working in a set. There were 4 pikemen associated in his cutting: himself, Zacharie, Levaque, and Chaval. If they had Catherine alone to wheel, the work would suffer. Suddenly he called out: "I have it! There was that man looking for work!" At that moment Dansaert passed before the shed. Maheu told him the story, and asked for his authority to engage the man. He emphasized the desire of the Company to substitute men for women, as at Anzin. The head captain smiled at first, for the scheme of excluding women from the pit was not usually well received by the miners, who were troubled about placing their daughters and not much affected by questions of morality and health. But after some hesitation he gave his permission, reserving its ratification for Monsieur Négrel, the engineer. "All very well!" exclaimed Zacharie. "The man must be away by this time." "No," said Catherine. "I saw him stop at the boilers." "After him, then, lazy!" cried Maheu. The young girl ran forward, while a crowd of miners proceeded to the shaft, yielding the fire to others. Jeanlin, without waiting for his father, went also to take his lamp, together with Bébert, a big stupid boy, and Lydie, a small child of 10. Mouquette, who was in front of them, called out in the black passage they were dirty brats, and threatened to box their ears if they pinched her. Étienne was, in fact, in the boiler building, talking with the stoker, who was charging the furnaces with coal. He felt very cold at the thought of the night into which he must return, but he was deciding to set out when he felt a hand placed on his shoulder. "Come," said Catherine, "there's something for you." At first he could not understand. Then he felt a spasm of joy, and vigorously squeezed the young girl's hands. "Thanks, mate. Ah, you're a good chap, you are." She began to laugh, looking at him in the red light of the furnaces, which lit them up. It amused her that he should take her for a boy, still slender, with her knot of hair hidden beneath the cap. He also was laughing, with satisfaction, and they remained for a moment both laughing in each other's faces with radiant cheeks. Maheu, squatting down before his box in the shed, was taking off his sabots and his coarse woollen stockings. When Étienne arrived, everything was settled in 3 or 4 words: 30 sous a day, hard work, but work that he would easily learn. The pikeman advised him to keep his shoes, and lent him an old cap, a leather hat for the protection of his skull, a precaution which the father and his children disdained. The tools were taken out of the chest, where also was found Florence's shovel. Then, when Maheu had shut up their sabots, their stockings, as well as Étienne's bundle, he suddenly became impatient. "What is that lazy Chaval up to? Another girl given a tumble on a pile of stones? We are half an hour late to day." Zacharie and Levaque were quietly roasting their shoulders. The former said at last: "Is it Chaval you're waiting for? He came before us, and went down at once." "What! You knew that and said nothing? Come, come, look sharp." Catherine, who was warming her hands, had to follow the band. Étienne allowed her to pass and went behind her. Again he journeyed through a maze of staircases and obscure corridors, in which their naked feet produced the soft sound of old slippers. But the lamp cabin was glittering. A glass house, full of hooks in rows, holding hundreds of Davy lamps, examined and washed the night before, and lighted like candles in a mortuary chapel. At the barrier each workman took his own, stamped with his number. Then he examined it and shut it himself, while the marker, seated at a table, inscribed on the registers the hour of descent. Maheu had to intervene to obtain a lamp for his new putter. And there was still another precaution. The workers defiled before an examiner, who assured himself that all the lamps were properly closed. "Golly! it's not warm here," murmured Catherine, shivering. Étienne contented himself with nodding his head. He was in front of the shaft, in the midst of a vast hall swept by currents of air. He certainly considered himself brave, but he felt a disagreeable emotion at his chest amid this thunder of trams, the hollow blows of the signals, the stifled howling of the trumpet, the continual flight of those cables, unrolled and rolled at full speed by the drums of the engine. The cages rose and sank with the gliding movement of a nocturnal beast, always engulfing men, whom the throat of the hole seemed to drink. It was his turn now. He felt very cold, and preserved a nervous silence which made Zacharie and Levaque grin, for both of them disapproved of the hiring of this unknown man, especially Levaque, who was offended that he had not been consulted. So Catherine was glad to hear her father explain things to the young man. "Look, above the cage there is a parachute with iron grapnels to catch into the guides in case of breakage. Does it work? Oh, not always. Yes, the shaft is divided into three compartments, closed by planking from top to bottom. In the middle the cages, on the left the passage for the ladders." But he interrupted himself to grumble, though taking care not to raise his voice much. "What are we stuck here for, blast it? What right have they to freeze us in this way?" The captain, Richomme, who was going down himself with his naked lamp fixed by a nail into the leather of his cap, heard him. "Careful! Look out for ears!" he murmured paternally, as an old miner with affectionate feeling for comrades. "Workmen must do what they can. Hold on! Here we are. Get in with your fellows." The cage, provided with iron bands and a small meshed lattice work, was in fact awaiting them on the bars. Maheu, Zacharie, and Catherine slid into a tram below, and as all five had to enter, Étienne in his turn went in. But the good places were taken. He had to squeeze himself near the young girl, whose elbow pressed into his belly. His lamp embarrassed him. They advised him to fasten it to the buttonhole of his jacket. Not hearing, he awkwardly kept it in his hand. The embarkation continued. Above and below, a confused packing of cattle. They did not, however, set out. What, then, was happening? It seemed to him that his impatience lasted for many minutes. At last he felt a shock, and the light grew dim. Everything around him seemed to fly, while he experienced the dizzy anxiety of a fall contracting his bowels. This lasted as long as he could see light, through the two reception stories, in the midst of the whirling by of the scaffolding. Then, having fallen into the blackness of the pit, he became stunned, no longer having any clear perception of his sensations. "Now we are off," said Maheu quietly. They were all at their ease. He asked himself at times if he was going up or down. Now and then, when the cage went straight, without touching the guides, there seemed to be no motion, but rough shocks were afterwards produced, a sort of dancing amid the joists, which made him fear a catastrophe. For the rest, he could not distinguish the walls of the shaft behind the lattice work, to which he pressed his face. The lamps feebly lighted the massive bodies at his feet. Only the captain's naked light in the neighbouring tram shone like a lighthouse. "This is 4 metres in diameter," continued Maheu, to instruct him. "The tubbing wants doing over again, for the water comes in everywhere. Stop! We are reaching the bottom. Do you hear?" Étienne was, in fact, now asking himself the meaning of this noise of falling rain. A few large drops had at first sounded on the roof of the cage, like the beginning of a shower, and now the rain increased, streaming down, becoming at last a deluge. The roof must be full of holes, for a thread of water was flowing on to his shoulder and wetting him to the skin. The cold became icy and they were buried in black humidity, when they passed through a sudden flash of light, the vision of a cavern in which men were moving. But already they had fallen back into darkness. Maheude said: "That is the first main level. We are at 320 metres. See the speed." Raising his lamp, he lighted up a joist of the guides which fled by like a rail, beneath a train going at full speed, and beyond, as before, nothing could be seen. They passed three other levels in flashes of light. The deafening rain continued to strike through the darkness. "How deep it is!" murmured Étienne. This fall seemed to last for hours. He was suffering for the cramped position he had taken, not daring to move, and especially tortured by Catherine's elbow. She did not speak a word; he only felt her against him, and it warmed him. When the cage at last stopped at the bottom, at 554 metres, he was astonished to learn that the descent had lasted exactly 1 minute. But the noise of the bolts fixing themselves, the sensation of solidity beneath, suddenly cheered him, and he was joking when he said to Catherine: "What have you got under your skin to be so warm? I've got your elbow in my belly, sure enough." Then she also burst out laughing. Stupid of him, still to take her for a boy! Were his eyes out? "It's in your eye that you got my elbow," she replied, in the midst of a storm of laughter which the astonished young man could not account for. The cage voided its burden of workers, who crossed the pit eye hall, a chamber cut in the rock, vaulted with masonry, and lighted up by three large lamps. Over the iron flooring the porters were violently rolling laden trams. A cavernous odour exhaled from the walls, a freshness of saltpetre in which mingled hot breaths from the neighbouring stable. The openings of four galleries yawned here. "This way," said Maheu to Étienne. "You're not there yet. It is still 2 kilometres." The workmen separated and were lost in groups in the depths of these black holes. Some 15 went off into that on the left, and Étienne walked last, behind Maheu, who was preceded by Catherine, Zacharie, and Levaque. It was a large gallery for wagons, through a bed of solid rock, which had only needed walling here and there. In single file they still went on without a word, by the tiny flame of the lamps. The young man stumbled at every step, and entangled his feet in the rails. For a moment a hollow sound disturbed him, the sound of a distant storm, the violence of which seemed to increase and to come from the bowels of the earth. Was it the thunder of a landslip bringing on to their heads the enormous mass which separated them from the light? A gleam pierced the night. He felt the rock tremble, and when he had placed himself close to the wall, like his comrades, he saw a large white horse close to his face, harnessed to a train of wagons. On the first, and holding the reins, was seated Bébert, while Jeanlin, with his hands leaning on the edge of the last, was running barefooted behind. They again began their walk. Farther on they reached crossways, where two new galleries opened, and the band divided again, the workers gradually entering all the stalls of the mine. Now the wagon gallery was constructed of wood. Props of timber supported the roof, and made for the crumbly rock a screen of scaffolding, behind which one could see the plates of schist, glimmering with mica, and coarse masses of dull, rough sandstone. Trains of tubs, full or empty, continually passed, crossing each other with their thunder, borne into the shadow by vague beasts trotting by like phantoms. On the double way of a shunting line a long black serpent slept, a train at standstill, with a snorting horse whose crupper looked like a block fallen from the roof. Doors for ventilation were slowly opening and shutting, and as they advanced the gallery became more narrow and lower, and the roof irregular, forcing them to bend their backs constantly. Étienne struck his head hard; without his leather cap he would have broken his skull. However, he attentively followed the slightest gestures of Maheu, whose sombre profile was seen against the glimmer of the lamps. None of the workmen knocked themselves. They evidently knew each boss, each knot of wood or swelling in the rock. The young man also suffered from the slippery soil, which became damper and damper. At times he went through actual puddles, only revealed by the muddy splash of his feet. But what especially astonished him were the sudden changes of temperature. At the bottom of the shaft it was very chilly, and in the wagon gallery, through which all the air of the mine passed, an icy breeze was blowing, with the violence of a tempest, between the narrow walls. Afterwards, As they penetrated more deeply along other passages which only received a meagre share of air, the wind fell and the heat increased, a suffocating heat as heavy as lead. Maheu had not again opened his mouth. He turned down another gallery to the right, simply saying to Étienne, without looking round: "The Guillaume seam." It was the seam which contained their cutting. At the first step Étienne hurt his head and elbows. The sloping roof descended so low that, for 20 or 30 metres at a time, he had to walk bent double. The water came up to his ankles. After 200 metres of this, he saw Levaque, Zacharie, and Catherine disappear, as though they had flown through a narrow fissure which was open in front of him. "We must climb," said Maheu. "Fasten your lamp to a buttonhole and hang on to the wood." He himself disappeared, and Étienne had to follow him. This chimney passage left in the seam was reserved for miners, and led to all the secondary passages. It was about the thickness of the coal bed, hardly 60 centimetres. Fortunately the young man was thin, for, as he was still awkward, he hoisted himself up with a useless expense of muscle, flattening his shoulders and hips, advancing by the strength of his wrists, clinging to the planks. 15 metres higher they came on the first secondary passage, but they had to continue, as the cutting of Maheu and his mates was in the sixth passage, in hell. As they said, every 15 metres the passages were placed over each other in never ending succession through this cleft, which scraped back and chest. Étienne groaned as if the weight of the rocks had pounded his limbs. With torn hands and bruised legs, he also suffered from lack of air, so that he seemed to feel the blood bursting through his skin. He vaguely saw in one passage 2 squatting beasts, a big one and a little one, pushing trams. They were Lydie and Mouquette, already at work, and he had still to climb the height of 2 cuttings! He was blinded by sweat, and he despaired of catching up the others, whose agile limbs he heard brushing against the rock with a long gliding movement. "Cheer up! Here we are," said Catherine's voice. He had, in fact, arrived, and another voice cried from the bottom of the cutting: "Well, is this the way to treat people? I have 2 kilometres to walk from Montsou, and I am here first." It was Chaval, a tall, lean, bony fellow of 25, with strongly marked features, who was in a bad humour at having to wait. When he saw Étienne he asked, with contemptuous surprise: "What's that?" And when Maheu had told him the story, he added between his teeth: "These men are eating the bread of girls." The 2 men exchanged a look, lighted up by one of those instinctive hatreds which suddenly flame up. Étienne had felt the insult without yet understanding it. There was silence, and they got to work. At last all the seams were gradually filled, and the cuttings were in movement at every level and at the end of every passage. The devouring shaft had swallowed its daily ration of men. Nearly 700 hands, who were now at work in this giant ant hill, everywhere making holes in the earth, drilling it like an old worm-eaten piece of wood. And in the middle of the heavy silence and crushing weight of the strata, one could hear, by placing one's ear to the rock, the movement of these human insects at work, from the flight of the cable which moved the cage up and down, to the biting of the tools cutting out the coal at the end of the stalls. Étienne, on turning round, found himself again pressed close to Catherine. But this time he caught a glimpse of the developing curves of her breast. He suddenly understood the warmth which had penetrated him. "You are a girl, then!" he exclaimed, stupefied. She replied, in her cheerful way, without blushing: "Of course! You've taken your time to find it out." Section 4 of Germinal by Émile Zola, translated by Havelock Ellis. This recording is in the public domain. Reading by Matt Perard. Part 1, Chapter 4. The 4 pikemen had spread themselves one above the other over the whole face of the cutting. Separated by planks hooked on to retain the fallen coal, they each occupied about 4 meters of the seam, and this seam was so thin, scarcely more than 50 centimeters thick at this spot, that they seemed to be flattened between the roof and the wall, dragging themselves along by their knees and elbows, and unable to turn without crushing their shoulders. In order to attack the coal, they had to lie on their sides with their necks twisted and arms raised, brandishing in a sloping direction their short-handled picks. Below there was, first, Zacharie. Levaque and Chaval were on the stages above, and at the very top was Maheu. Each worked at the slaty bed, which he dug out with blows of the pick. Then he made 2 vertical cuttings in the bed and detached the block by burying an iron wedge in its upper part. The coal was rich. The block broke and rolled in fragments along their bellies and thighs. When these fragments, retained by the plank, had collected round them, the pikemen disappeared, buried in the narrow cleft. Maheu suffered most. At the top the temperature rose to 35 degrees, and the air was stagnant, so that in the long run it became lethal. In order to see, he had been obliged to fix his lamp to a nail near his head, and this lamp, close to his skull, still further heated his blood. But his torment was especially aggravated by the moisture. The rock above him, a few centimetres from his face, streamed with water, which fell in large continuous rapid drops with a sort of obstinate rhythm, always at the same spot. It was vain for him to twist his head or bend back his neck. They fell on his face, dropping unceasingly. In a quarter of an hour he was soaked, and at the same time covered with sweat, smoking as with the hot steam of a laundry. This morning a drop beating upon his eye made him swear. He would not leave his picking. He dealt great strokes which shook him violently between the 2 rocks, like a fly caught between 2 leaves of a book and in danger of being completely flattened. Not a word was exchanged. They all hammered. One only heard these irregular blows, which seemed veiled and remote. The sounds had a sonorous hoarseness, without any echo in the dead air, and it seemed that the darkness was an unknown blackness, thickened by the floating coal dust, made heavy by the gas which weighed on the eyes. The wicks of the lamps, beneath their caps of metallic tissue, only showed as reddish points. One could distinguish nothing. The cutting opened out above like a large chimney, flat and oblique, in which the soot of 10 years had amassed a profound night. Spectral figures were moving in it. The gleams of light enabled one to catch a glimpse of a rounded hip, a knotty arm, a vigorous head, besmeared as if for a crime. Sometimes blocks of coal shone suddenly as they became detached, illuminated by a crystalline reflection. Then everything fell back into darkness. Pickaxes struck great hollow blows. One only heard panting chests, the grunting of discomfort and weariness beneath the weight of the air and the rain of the springs. Zacharie, with arms weakened by a spree of the night before, soon left his work on the pretence that more timbering was necessary. This allowed him to forget himself in quiet whistling, his eyes vaguely resting in the shade. Behind the pikemen, nearly 3 meters of the seam were clear, and they had not yet taken the precaution of supporting the rock, having grown careless of danger and miserly of their time. "Here, you swell!" cried the young man to Étienne. "Hand up some wood." Étienne, who was learning from Catherine how to manage his shovel, had to raise the wood in the cutting. A small supply had remained over from yesterday. It was usually sent down every morning, ready cut to fit the bed. "Hurry up there, damn it!" shouted Zacharie, seeing the new putter hoist himself up awkwardly in the midst of the coal, his arms embarrassed by 4 pieces of oak. He made a hole in the roof with his pickaxe, and then another in the wall, and wedged in the 2 ends of the wood, which thus supported the rock. In the afternoon the workers in the earth cutting took the rubbish left at the bottom of the gallery by the pikemen, and cleared out the exhausted section of the seam, in which they destroyed the wood, being only careful about the lower and upper roads for the haulage. Maheu ceased to groan. At last he had detached his block, and he wiped his streaming face on his sleeve. He was worried about what Zacharie was doing behind him. "Let it be," he said. "We will see after breakfast. Better go on hewing, if we want to make up our share of trams." "It's because it's sinking," replied the young man. "Look, there's a crack. It may slip." But the father shrugged his shoulders. "Ah, nonsense! Slip! And if it did, it would not be the first time. They would get out of it all right." He grew angry at last, and sent his son to the front of the cutting. All of them, however, were now stretching themselves. Levaque, resting on his back, was swearing as he examined his left thumb, which had been grazed by the fall of a piece of sandstone. Chaval had taken off his shirt in a fury, and was working with bare chest and back for the sake of coolness. They were already black with coal, soaked in a fine dust diluted with sweat which ran down in streams and pools. Maheu first began again to hammer, lower down, with his head level with the rock. Now the drop struck his forehead so obstinately that he seemed to feel it piercing a hole in the bone of his skull. "You mustn't mind," explained Catherine to Étienne. "They are always howling." And like a good natured girl she went on with her lesson. Every laden tram arrived at the top in the same condition as it left the cutting, marked with a special metal token, so that the receiver might put it to the reckoning of the stall. It was necessary, therefore, to be very careful to fill it, and only to take clean coal; otherwise it was refused at the receiving office. The young man, whose eyes were now becoming accustomed to the darkness, looked at her, still white with her chlorotic complexion, and he could not have told her age. He thought she must be 12, she seemed to him so slight. However, he felt she must be older, with her boyish freedom, a simple audacity which confused him a little. She did not please him. He thought her too roguish, with her pale Pierrot head framed at the temples by the cap. But what astonished him was the strength of this child, a nervous strength which was blended with a good deal of skill. She filled her tram faster than he could, with quick small regular strokes of the shovel. She afterwards pushed it to the inclined way with a single slow push, without a hitch, easily passing under the low rocks. He tore himself to pieces, got off the rails, and was reduced to despair. It was certainly not a convenient road. It was 60 metres from the cutting to the upbrow, and the passage, which the miners in the earth cutting had not yet enlarged, was a mere tube with a very irregular roof, swollen by innumerable bosses. At certain spots the laden tram could only just pass. The putter had to flatten himself, to push on his knees, in order not to break his head. And besides this the wood was already bending and yielding. One could see it broken in the middle in long pale rents like an overweak crutch. One had to be careful not to graze oneself in these fractures, and beneath the slow crushing, which caused the splitting of billets of oak as large as the thigh, one had to glide almost on one's belly with the secret fear of suddenly hearing one's back break. "Again!" said Catherine, laughing. Étienne's tram had gone off the rails at the most difficult spot. He could not roll straight on these rails which sank in the damp earth, and he swore, became angry, and fought furiously with the wheels, which he could not get back into place in spite of exaggerated efforts. "Wait a bit," said the young girl. "If you get angry it will never go." Skilfully she had glided down and thrust her buttocks beneath the tram, and by putting the weight on her loins she raised it and replaced it. The weight was 700 kilogrammes. Surprised and ashamed, he stammered excuses. She was obliged to show him how to straddle his legs and brace his feet against the planking on both sides of the gallery, in order to give himself a more solid fulcrum. The body had to be bent, the arms made stiff so as to push with all the muscles of the shoulders and hips. During the journey he followed her, and watched her proceed with tense back, her fists so low that she seemed trotting on all fours, like one of those dwarf beasts that perform at circuses. She sweated, panted, her joints cracked, but without a complaint, with the indifference of custom, as if it were the common wretchedness of all to live thus bent double. But he could not succeed in doing as much. His shoes troubled him. His body seemed broken by walking in this way with lowered head. At the end of a few minutes the position became a torture, an intolerable anguish, so painful that he got on his knees for a moment to straighten himself and breathe. Then at the upbrow there was more labour. She taught him to fill his tram quickly. At the top and bottom of this inclined plane, which served all the cuttings from one level to the other, there was a trammer, the brakesman above, the receiver below. These scamps of 12 to 15 years shouted abominable words to each other, and to warn them it was necessary to yell still more violently. Then, as soon as there was an empty tram to send back, the receiver gave the signal and the putter embarked her full tram, the weight of which made the other ascend when the brakesman loosened his brake. Below, in the bottom gallery, were formed the trains which the horses drew to the shaft. "Here, you confounded rascals!" cried Catherine in the inclined way, which was wood lined, about 100 metres long, and resounded like a gigantic trumpet. The trammers must have been resting, for neither of them replied. On all the levels haulage had stopped. A shrill girl's voice said at last: "One of them must be on moquette, sure enough." There was a roar of laughter, and the putters of the whole scene held their sides. "Who is that?" asked Étienne of Catherine. The latter named little Lydie, a scamp who knew more than she ought, and who pushed her tram as stoutly as a woman in spite of her doll's arms. As to Mouquette, she was quite capable of being with both the trammers at once. But the voice of the receiver arose, shouting out to load. Doubtless a captain was passing beneath. Haulage began again on the 9 levels, and one only heard the regular calls of the trammers and the snorting of the putters arriving at the upbrow and steaming like overladen mares. It was the element of bestiality which breathed in the pit, the sudden desire of the male. When a miner met one of these girls on all fours, with her flanks in the air and her hips bursting through her boy's breeches. And on each journey Étienne found again at the bottom the stuffiness of the cutting, the hollow and broken cadence of the axes, the deep, painful sighs of the pikemen persisting in their work. All four were naked, mixed up with the coal, soaked with black mud up to the cap. At one moment it had been necessary to free Maheu, who was gasping, and to remove the planks so that the coal could fall into the passage. Zacharie and Levaque became enraged with the seam, which was now hard, they said, and which would make the condition of their account disastrous. Chaval turned, lying for a moment on his back, abusing Étienne, whose presence decidedly exasperated him. "A sort of worm, hasn't the strength of a girl. Are you going to fill your tub? It's to spare your arms, eh? Damned if I don't keep back the 10 sous if you get us one refused." The young man avoided replying, too happy at present to have found this convict's labour and accepting the brutal rule of the worker by master worker. But he could no longer walk, his feet were bleeding, his limbs torn by horrible cramps, his body confined in an iron girdle. Fortunately it was 10 o'clock, and the stall decided to have breakfast. Maheude had a watch, but he did not even look at it. At the bottom of this starless night he was never 5 minutes out. All put on their shirts and jackets. Then, descending from the cutting, they squatted down, their elbows to their sides, their buttocks on their heels, in that posture so habitual with miners that they keep it even when out of the mine, without feeling the need of a stone or a beam to sit on. And each, having taken out his brick, bit seriously at the thick slice, uttering occasional words on the morning's work. Catherine, who remained standing, at last joined Étienne, who had stretched himself out farther along, across the rails, with his back against the planking. There was a place there almost dry. "You don't eat?" she said to him, with her mouth full and her brick in her hand. Then she remembered that this youth, wandering about at night without a sou, perhaps had not a bit of bread. "Will you share with me?" And as he refused, declaring that he was not hungry, while his voice trembled with a gnawing in his stomach, she went on cheerfully: "Ah, if you are fastidious! But here, I've only bitten on that side. I'll give you this." She had already broken the bread and butter into two pieces. The young man, taking his half, restrained himself from devouring it all at once, and placed his arms on his thighs so that she should not see how he trembled. With her quiet air of good comradeship she lay beside him at full length on her stomach, with her chin in one hand, slowly eating with the other. Their lamps, placed between them, lit up their faces. Catherine looked at him a moment in silence. She must have found him handsome, with his delicate face and black moustache. She vaguely smiled with pleasure. "Then you are an engine driver, and they sent you away from your railway? Why?" "Because I struck my chief." She remained stupefied, overwhelmed with her hereditary ideas of subordination and passive obedience. "I ought to say that I had been drinking," he went on, "and when I drink I get mad. I could devour myself, and I could devour other people. Yes, I can't swallow two small glasses without wanting to kill some one. Then I am ill for 2 days." "You mustn't drink," she said, seriously. "Ah, don't be afraid. I know myself." And he shook his head. He hated brandy with the hatred of the last child of a race of drunkards, who suffered in his flesh from all those ancestors, soaked and driven mad by alcohol to such a point that the least drop had become poison to him. "It is because of mother that I didn't like being turned into the street," he said, after having swallowed a mouthful. "Mother is not happy, and I used to send her a 5 franc piece now and then." "Where is she, then, your mother?" "At Paris. A laundress, Rue de la Goutte d'Or." There was silence. When he thought of these things a tremor dimmed his dark eyes. The sudden anguish of the injury he brooded over in his fine, youthful strength. For a moment he remained with his looks buried in the darkness of the mine. And at that depth, beneath the weight and suffocation of the earth, he saw his childhood again, his mother still beautiful and strong, forsaken by his father, then taken up again after having married another man, living with the two men who ruined her, rolling with them in the gutter, in drink and ordure. It was down there, he recalled the street, the details came back to him, the dirty linen in the middle of the shop, the drunken carousals that made the house stink, and the jaw‐breaking blows. "Now," he began again, in a slow voice, "I haven't even 30 sous to make her presents with. She will die of misery, sure enough." He shrugged his shoulders with despair, and again bit at his bread and butter. "Will you drink?" asked Catherine, uncorking her tin. "Oh, it's coffee, it won't hurt you. One gets dry when one eats like that." But he refused. It was quite enough to have taken half her bread. However, she insisted good naturedly, and said at last: "Well, I will drink before you, since you are so polite. Only you can't refuse now. It would be rude." She held out her tin to him. She had got on to her knees and he saw her quite close to him, lit up by the two lamps. Why had he found her ugly? Now that she was black, her face powdered with fine charcoal, she seemed to him singularly charming. In this face, surrounded by shadow, the teeth in the broad mouth shone with whiteness, while the eyes looked large and gleamed with a greenish reflection like a cat's eyes. A lock of red hair which had escaped from her cap tickled her ear, and made her laugh. She no longer seemed so young; she might be quite 14. "To please you," he said, drinking and giving her back the tin. She swallowed a second mouthful and forced him to take one too, wishing to share, she said, and that little tin that went from one mouth to the other amused them. He suddenly asked himself if he should not take her in his arms and kiss her lips. She had large lips of a pale rose colour made vivid by the coal, which tormented him with increasing desire. But he did not dare, intimidated before her, only having known girls on the streets of Lille of the lowest order, and not realizing how one ought to behave with a work girl still living with her family. "You must be about 14, then?" he asked. after having gone back to his bread. She was astonished, almost angry. "What? 14? But I am 15. It's true, I'm not big. Girls don't grow quick with us." He went on questioning her, and she told everything without boldness or shame. For the rest, she was not ignorant concerning man and woman, although he felt that her body was virginal, with the virginity of a child delayed in her sexual maturity by the environment of bad air and weariness in which she lived. When he spoke of Mouquette, in order to embarrass her, she told some horrible stories in a quiet voice, with much amusement. Ah! she did some fine things! And as he asked if she herself had no lovers, she replied jokingly that she did not wish to vex her mother, but that it must happen some day. Her shoulders were bent, she shivered a little from the coldness of her garments, soaked in sweat, with a gentle resigned air, ready to submit to things and men. "People can find lovers when they all live together, can't they?" "Sure enough. And then it doesn't hurt any one. One doesn't tell the priest." "Oh, the priest! I don't care for him. But there is the black man." "What do you mean, the black man?" "The old miner who comes back into the pit and wrings naughty girls' necks." He looked at her, afraid that she was making fun of him. "You believe in those stupid things? Then you don't know anything." "Yes, I do. I can read and write. That is useful among us. In father and mother's time they learnt nothing." She was certainly very charming. When she had finished her bread and butter he would take her and kiss her on her large rosy lips. It was the resolution of timidity, a thought of violence which choked his voice. These boy's clothes, this jacket and these breeches on the girl's flesh excited and troubled him. He had swallowed his last mouthful. He drank from the tin and gave it back to her to empty. Now the moment for action had come, and he cast a restless glance at the miners farther on, but a shadow blocked the gallery. For a moment Chaval stood and looked at them from afar. He came forward, having assured himself that Maheu could not see him, and as Catherine was seated on the earth he seized her by the shoulders, drew her head back, and tranquilly crushed her mouth beneath a brutal kiss, affecting not to notice Étienne. There was in that kiss an act of possession, a sort of jealous resolution. However, the young girl was offended. "Let me go, do you hear?" He kept hold of her head and looked into her eyes. His moustache and small red beard flamed in his black face with its large eagle nose. He let her go at last, and went away without speaking a word. A shudder had frozen Étienne. It was stupid to have waited. He could certainly not kiss her now, for she would, perhaps, think that he wished to behave like the other. In his wounded vanity he experienced real despair. "Why did you lie?" he said in a low voice. "He's your lover." "But no, I swear," she cried. "There is not that between us. Sometimes he likes a joke. He doesn't even belong here. It's 6 months since he came from the Pas de Calais." Both rose. Work was about to be resumed. When she saw him so cold she seemed annoyed. Doubtless she found him handsomer than the other. She would have preferred him perhaps. The idea of some amiable, consoling relationship disturbed her, and when the young man saw with surprise that his lamp was burning blue with a large pale ring, she tried at least to amuse him. "Come, I will show you something," she said in a friendly way. When she had led him to the bottom of the cutting, she pointed out to him a crevice in the coal. A slight bubbling escaped from it, a little noise like the warbling of a bird. "Put your hand there, you'll feel the wind. It's fire damp." He was surprised. Was that all? Was that the terrible thing which blew everything up? She laughed. She said there was a good deal of it to day to make the flame of the lamp so blue. "Now, if you've done chattering, lazy louts!" cried Maheu's rough voice. Catherine and Étienne hastened to fill their trams, and pushed them to the upbrow with stiffened back, crawling beneath the bossy roof of the passage. Even after the second journey the sweat ran off them and their joints began to crack. The pikemen had resumed work in the cutting. The men often shortened their breakfast to avoid getting cold, and their bricks, eaten in this way far from the sun, with silent voracity, loaded their stomachs with lead. Stretched on their sides, they hammered more loudly, with the one fixed idea of filling a large number of trams. Every thought disappeared in this rage for gain which was so hard to earn. They no longer felt the water which streamed on them and swelled their limbs, the cramps of forced attitudes, the suffocation of the darkness in which they grew pale, like plants put in a cellar. Yet, as the day advanced, the air became more poisoned and heated with the smoke of the lamps, with the pestilence of their breaths, with the asphyxia of the fire damp, blinding to the eyes like spiders' webs, which only the aeration of the night could sweep away. At the bottom of their molehill, beneath the weight of the earth, with no more breath in their inflamed lungs, they went on hammering. Section 5 of Germinal by Émile Zola, translated by Havelock Ellis. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Matt Berard. Part 1, Chapter 5. Maheu, without looking at his watch, which she had left in his jacket, stopped and said: "1 o'clock directly. Zacharie, is it done?" The young man had just been at the planking. In the midst of his labour he had been lying on his back, with dreamy eyes, thinking over a game of hockey of the night before. He woke up and replied: "Yes, it will do. We shall see to morrow." And he came back to take his place at the cutting. Levaque and Chaval had also dropped their picks. They were all resting. They wiped their faces on their naked arms and looked at the roof, in which slaty masses were cracking. They only spoke about their work. "Another chance," murmured Chaval, "of getting into loose earth. They didn't take account of that in the bargain." "Rascals!" growled Levaque. "They only want to bury us in it." Zacharie began to laugh. He cared little for the work and the rest, but it amused him to hear the Company abused. In his placid way Maheu explained that the nature of the soil changed every 20 metres. One must be just; they could not foresee everything. Then, when the two others went on talking against the masters, he became restless, and looked around him. "Hush! That's enough." "You're right," said Levaque, also lowering his voice. "It isn't wholesome." A morbid dread of spies haunted them, even at this depth, as if the shareholders' coal, while still in the seam, might have ears. "That won't prevent me," added Chaval, loudly, in a defiant manner, "from lodging a brick in the belly of that damned Dansaert, if he talks to me as he did the other day. I won't prevent him, I won't, from buying pretty girls with a white skin." This time Zacharie burst out laughing. The head captain's love for Pierronne was a constant joke in the pit. Even Catherine rested on her shovel at the bottom of the cutting, holding her sides, and in a few words told Étienne the joke, while Maheu became angry, seized by a fear which he could not conceal. "Will you hold your tongue, eh? Wait till you're alone if you want to get into trouble." He was still speaking when the sound of steps was heard in the upper gallery. Almost immediately the engineer of the mine, little Négrel, as the workmen called him among themselves, appeared at the top of the cutting, accompanied by Dansaert, the head captain. "Didn't I say so?" muttered Maheu. "There's always someone there, rising out of the ground." Paul Négrel, M. Hennebeau's nephew, was a young man of 26, refined and handsome, with curly hair and brown moustache. His pointed nose and sparkling eyes gave him the air of an amiable ferret of sceptical intelligence, which changed into an abrupt authoritative manner in his relations with the workmen. He was dressed like them, and like them smeared with coal. To make them respect him he exhibited a daredevil courage, passing through the most difficult spots and always first when landslips or fire damp explosions occurred. "Here we are we not, Dansaert?" he asked. The head captain, a coarse faced Belgian, with a large sensual nose, replied with exaggerated politeness. "Yes, Monsieur Négrel, here is the man who was taken on this morning." Both of them had slid down into the middle of the cutting. They made Étienne come up. The engineer raised his lamp and looked at him without asking any questions. "Good," he said at last. "But I don't like unknown men to be picked up from the road. Don't do it again." He did not listen to the explanations given to him, the necessities of work, the desire to replace women by men for the haulage. He had begun to examine the roof while the pikemen had taken up their picks again. Suddenly he called out: "I say there, Maheu, have you no care for life? By heavens! You will all be buried here." "Oh, it's solid," replied the workman tranquilly. "What, solid? But the rock is giving already, and you are planting props at more than 2 meters, as if you grudged it. Ah! you are all alike. You will let your skull be flattened, rather than leave the seam to give the necessary time to the timbering. I must ask you to prop that immediately. Double the timbering, do you understand?" And in the face of the unwillingness of the miners who disputed the point, saying that they were good judges of their safety, he became angry. "Go along! When your heads are smashed, is it you who will have to bear the consequences? Not at all. It will be the Company which will have to pay you pensions, you or your wives. I tell you again that we know you. In order to get 2 extra trams by evening, you would sell your skins." Maheu, in spite of the anger which was gradually mastering him, still answered steadily: "If they paid us enough we should prop it better." The engineer shrugged his shoulders without replying. He had descended the cutting, and only said in conclusion, from below: "You have an hour. Set to work, all of you, and I give you notice that the stall is fined 3 francs." A low growl from the pikemen greeted these words. The force of the system alone restrained them, that military system which, from the trammer to the head captain, ground one beneath the other. Chaval and Levaque, however, made a furious gesture, while Maheu restrained them by a glance, and Zacharie shrugged his shoulders chaffingly. But Étienne was, perhaps, most affected. Since he had found himself at the bottom of this hell, a slow rebellion was rising within him. He looked at the resigned Catherine, with her lowered back. Was it possible to kill oneself at this hard toil, in this deadly darkness, and not even to gain the few pence to buy one's daily bread? However, Négrel went off with Dansaert, who was content to approve by a continual movement of his head. And their voices again rose. They had just stopped once more, and were examining the timbering in the gallery, which the pikemen were obliged to look after for a length of 10 meters behind the cutting. "Didn't I tell you that they care nothing?" cried the engineer. "And you, why in the devil's name don't you watch them?" "But I do," stammered the head captain. "One gets tired of repeating things." Négrel called loudly: "Maheu! Maheu!" They all came down. He went on: "Do you see that? Will that hold? It's a 2 penny halfpenny construction. Here is a beam which the posts don't carry already. It was done so hastily. By Jove! I understand how it is that the mending costs us so much. It'll do, won't it? If it lasts as long as you have the care of it. And then it may go smash, and the Company is obliged to have an army of repairers. Look at it down there! It is mere botching." Chaval wished to speak, but he silenced him. "No, I know what you are going to say. Let them pay you more, eh? Very well. I warn you that you will force the managers to do something. They will pay you the planking separately, and proportionately reduce the price of the trams. We shall see if you will gain that way. Meanwhile, prop that over again, at once. I shall pass to morrow." Amid the dismay caused by this threat he went away. Dansaert, who had been so humble, remained behind a few moments, to say brutally to the men: "You get me into a row, you hear? I'll give you something more than 3 francs fine, I will. Look out!" Then, when he had gone, Maheu broke out in his turn. By God, what's fair is fair. I like people to be calm, because that's the only way of getting along, but at last they make you mad. Did you hear? The tram lowered, and the planking separately. Another way of paying us less. By God, it is." He looked for someone upon whom to vent his anger, and saw Catherine and Étienne swinging their arms. "Will you just fetch me some wood? What does it matter to you? I'll put my foot into you somewhere." Étienne went to carry it without rancour for this rough speech, so furious himself against the masters that he thought the miners too good natured. As for the others, Levaque and Chaval had found relief in strong language. All of them, even Zacharie, were timbering furiously. For nearly half an hour one only heard the creaking of wood wedged in by blows of the hammer. They no longer spoke, they snorted, became enraged with the rock, which they would have hustled and driven back by the force of their shoulders if they had been able. "That's enough," said Maheu at last, worn out with anger and fatigue. "An hour and a half, a fine day's work. We shan't get 50 sous. I'm off. This disgusts me." Though there was still half an hour of work left, he dressed himself. The others imitated him. The mere sight of the cutting enraged them. As the putter had gone back to the haulage, they called her, irritated at her zeal. Let the coal take care of itself. And the six, their tools under their arms, set out to walk the 2 kilometres back, returning to the shaft by the road of the morning. At the chimney, Catherine and Étienne were delayed while the pikemen slid down. They met little Lydie, who stopped in a gallery to let them pass, and told them of the disappearance of Mouquette, whose nose had been bleeding so much that she had been away an hour, bathing her face somewhere, no one knew where. Then, when they left her, the child began again to push her tram, weary and muddy, stiffening her insect like arms and legs like a lean black ant struggling with a load that was too heavy for it. They let themselves down on their backs, flattening their shoulders for fear of scratching the skin on their foreheads, and they walked so close to the polished rock at the back of the stalls that they were obliged from time to time to hold on to the woodwork, so that their backsides should not catch fire, as they said jokingly. Below they found themselves alone. Red stars appeared afar at a bend in the passage. Their cheerfulness fell. They began to walk with the heavy step of fatigue, she in front, he behind. Their lamps were blackened. He could scarcely see her, drowned in a sort of smoky mist, and the idea that she was a girl disturbed him because he felt that it was stupid not to embrace her, and yet the recollection of the other man prevented him. Certainly she had lied to him. The other was her lover. They lay together on all those heaps of slaty coal, for she had a loose woman's gait. He sulked without reason, as if she had deceived him. She, however, every moment turned round, warned him of obstacles, and seemed to invite him to be affectionate. They were so lost here; it would have been so easy to laugh together like good friends. At last they entered the large haulage gallery. It was a relief to the indecision from which he was suffering, while she once more had a saddened look, the regret for a happiness which they would not find again. Now the subterranean life rumbled around them with the continual passing of captains, the come and go of the trams drawn by trotting horses. Lamps starred the night everywhere. They had to efface themselves against the rock to leave the path free to shadowy men and beasts, whose breath came against their faces. Jeanlin, running barefooted behind his tram, cried out some naughtiness to them which they could not hear amid the thunder of the wheels. They still went on, she now silent, he not recognizing the turnings and roads of the morning, and fancying that she was leading him deeper and deeper into the earth. And what specially troubled him was the cold, an increasing cold which he had felt on emerging from the cutting, and which caused him to shiver the more the nearer they approached the shaft. Between the narrow walls the column of air now blew like a tempest. He despaired of ever coming to the end, when suddenly they found themselves in the pit eye hall. Chaval cast a sidelong glance at them. his mouth drawn with suspicion. The others were there, covered with sweat in the icy current, silent like himself, swallowing their grunts of rage. They had arrived too soon, and could not be taken to the top for half an hour, more especially since some complicated manoeuvres were going on for lowering a horse. The porters were still rolling the trams with the deafening sound of old iron in movement, and the cages were flying up, disappearing in the rain which fell from the black hole. Below, the sump, a cesspool 10 meters deep, filled with this streaming water, also exhaled its muddy moisture. Men were constantly moving around the shaft, pulling the signal cords, pressing on the arms of levers, in the midst of this spray in which their garments were soaked. The reddish light of 3 open lamps cut out great moving shadows and gave to this subterranean hall the air of a villainous cavern, some bandit's forge, near a torrent. Maheu made one last effort. He approached Pierron, who had gone on duty at 6 o'clock. "Here, you might as well let us go up." But the porter, a handsome fellow with strong limbs and a gentle face, refused with a frightened gesture. "Impossible. Ask the captain. They would find me." Fresh growls were stifled. Catherine bent forward and said in Étienne's ear: "Come and see the stable, then. That's a comfortable place." And they had to escape without being seen, for it was forbidden to go there. It was on the left, at the end of a short gallery, 25 meters in length and nearly 4 high, cut in the rock and vaulted with bricks. It could contain 20 horses. It was, in fact, comfortable there. There was a pleasant warmth of living beasts, the good odour of fresh and well kept litter. The only lamp threw out the calm rays of a night light. There were horses there, at rest, who turned their heads with their large, infantine eyes, then went back to their hay, without haste, like fat, well kept workers, loved by everybody. But as Catherine was reading aloud their names, written on zinc plates over the mangers, she uttered a slight cry, seeing something suddenly rise before her. It was Mouquette, who emerged in fright from a pile of straw in which she was sleeping. On Monday, when she was overtired with her Sunday spree, she gave herself a violent blow on the nose, and left her cutting under the pretence of seeking water, to bury herself here with the horses in the warm litter. Her father, being weak with her, allowed it, and at the risk of getting into trouble. Just then Mouque, the father, entered, a short, bald, worn out looking man, but still stout, which is rare in an old miner of 50. Since he had been made a groom, he chewed to such a degree that his gums bled in his black mouth. On seeing the two with his daughter, he became angry. "What are you up to there, all of you? Come, up! The jades! Bringing a man here! It's a fine thing to come and do your dirty tricks in my straw." Mouquette thought it funny, and held her sides. But Étienne, feeling awkward, moved away, while Catherine smiled at him. As all three returned to the pit eye, Bébert and Jeanlin arrived there also with a train of tubs. There was a stoppage for the manoeuvring of the cages, and the young girl approached their horse, caressed it with her hand, and talked about it to her companion. It was Bataille, the doyen of the mine, a white horse who had lived below for 10 years. These 10 years he had lived in this hole, occupying the same corner of the stable, doing the same task along the black galleries without ever seeing daylight. Very fat, with shining coat and a good-natured air, he seemed to lead the existence of a sage, sheltered from the evils of the world above. In this darkness, too, he had become very cunning. The passage in which he worked had grown so familiar to him that he could open the ventilation doors with his head, and he lowered himself to avoid knocks at the narrow spots. Without doubt, also, he counted his turns, for when he had made the regulation number of journeys, he refused to do any more, and had to be led back to his manger. Now that old age was coming on, his cat's eyes were sometimes dimmed with melancholy. Perhaps he vaguely saw again, in the depths of his obscure dreams, the mill at which he was born, near Marchiennes, a mill placed on the edge of the Scarpe, surrounded by large fields over which the wind always blew. Something burnt in the air, an enormous lamp, the exact appearance of which escaped his beast's memory, and he stood with lowered head, trembling on his old feet, making useless efforts to recall the sun. Meanwhile the manoeuvres went on in the shaft. The signal hammer had struck 4 blows, and the horse was being lowered. There was always excitement at such a time, for it sometimes happened that the beast was seized by such terror that it was landed dead. When put into a net at the top, it struggled fiercely; then, when it felt the ground no longer beneath it, it remained as if petrified and disappeared without a quiver of the skin, with enlarged and fixed eyes. This animal being too big to pass between the guides, it had been necessary, when hooking it beneath the cage, to pull down the head and attach it to the flanks. The descent lasted nearly 3 minutes, the engine being slowed as a precaution. Below the excitement was increasing. What then? Was he going to be left on the road, hanging in the blackness? At last he appeared in his stony immobility, his eye fixed and dilated with terror. It was a bay horse hardly 3 years of age, called Trompette. "Attention!" cried Father Mouque, whose duty it was to receive it. "Bring him here. Don't undo him yet." Trompette was soon placed on the metal floor in a mass. Still he did not move. He seemed in a nightmare in this obscure infinite hole, this deep hall echoing with tumult. They were beginning to unfasten him, when Bataille, who had just been unharnessed, approached and stretched out his neck to smell this companion who lay on the earth. The workmen jokingly enlarged the circle. Well, what pleasant odour did he find in him? But Bataille, deaf to mockery, became animated. He probably found in him the good odour of the open air, the forgotten odour of the sun on the grass, and he suddenly broke out into a sonorous neigh, full of musical gladness, in which there seemed to be the emotion of a sob. It was a greeting, the joy of those ancient things of which a gust had reached him, the melancholy of one more prisoner who would not ascend again until death. "Ah! that animal Bataille!" shouted the workmen, amused at the antics of their favourite. "He's talking with his mate." Trompette was unbound, but still did not move. He remained on his flank, as if he still felt the net restraining him, garrotted by fear. At last they got him up with a lash of the whip, dazed and his limbs quivering. And Father Mouque led away the 2 beasts, fraternizing together. "Here, is it ready yet?" asked Maheu. It was necessary to clear the cages, and besides it was yet 10 minutes before the hour for ascending. Little by little the stalls emptied, and the miners returned from all the galleries. There were already some 50 men there, damp and shivering, their inflamed chests panting on every side. Pierron, in spite of his mawkish face, struck his daughter Lydie, because she had left the cutting before time. Zacharie slyly pinched Mouquette, with a joke about warming himself. But the discontent increased. Chaval and Levaque narrated the engineer's threat, the tram to be lowered in price, and the planking paid separately. And exclamations greeted the scheme. A rebellion was germinating in this little corner, nearly 600 metres beneath the earth. Soon they could not restrain their voices. These men, soiled by coal, and frozen by the delay, accused the Company of killing half their workers at the bottom, and starving the other half to death. Étienne listened, trembling. "Quick! Quick!" repeated the captain, Richomme, to the porters. He hastened the preparations for the ascent, not wishing to be hard, pretending not to hear. However, the murmurs became so loud that he was obliged to notice them. They were calling out behind him that this would not last always, and that one fine day the whole affair would be smashed up. "You're sensible," he said to Maheu. "Make them hold their tongues. When one hasn't got power one must have sense." But Maheu, who was getting calm, and had at last become anxious, did not interfere. Suddenly the voices fell. Négrel and Dansaert, returning from their inspection, entered from a gallery, both of them sweating. The habit of discipline made the men stand in rows, while the engineer passed through the group without a word. He got into one tram, and the head captain into another. The signal was sounded 5 times, ringing for the butcher's meat, as they said for the masters, and the cage flew up in the air in the midst of a gloomy silence. Section 6